Uh, our next speaker is Dr. Jim Christ. And those of you who are regular attendees of our symposium know Dr. Christ very well. He's been the moderator of practically all of our symposiums, but today he's a speaker. Jim is a professor emeritus of history at North Carolina State. He's authored or co-authored 10 books related to Texas history and has received state, national, and international awards for his writings. In 2005, he published Sleuthing the Alamo, Davy Crockett's Last Stand, and Other Mysteries of the Texas Revolution. This is an outstanding contemporary perspective on the Revolution era, where he discusses some of the stories that emerged from that time frame. In 1992, however, he became interested in Hermann Ehrenberg, a young Prussian boy who participated in the Texas Revolution. Ehrenberg came to Texas in 1835. He participated in the Siege of Bear, then joined Fannon's command, where he participated in the Battle of Colado Creek and was among the few who escaped the massacre at Goliad. He returned to Germany in 1843 and published his memoirs. These cover his personal experiences in the Texas Revolution, but he also includes chapters on the Alamo and San Jacinto, even though he did not participate in either one of those events. The book was republished in 1844 and 1845 under different titles, and Ehrenberg then returned to the United States, where he had more adventures in California, Arizona, and Hawaii before he was killed in 1866 in California. In 1999, Jim wrote an article about Ehrenberg published in the Southwestern Historical Quarterly. In this article, he said, and I quote, "It is one of the great ironies of the historiography of the Texas Revolution that the longest and most vivid eyewitness account of the revolt by a Texan soldier has never existed in a complete and reliable edition in the English language, nor has the kaleidoscopic life of Hermann Ehrenberg, the author of this memoir, ever received adequate or even generally accurate biographical treatment," unquote. Well, we fast forward 22 years later to 2021, and Jim has finally done it. He wrote what will certainly be recognized as the definitive biography of Hermann Ehrenberg, with a very meticulous translation of the German edition. The book is at the printers now and is expected to be out later this year, but we're privileged today to get a preview. The highlights of the life of a remarkable survivor of the Texan Revolution, a perspective from a Prussian immigrant. So now let's hear from Jim Christ talk about the man who wasn't there. Hermann Ehrenberg tells the stories of the Alamo and San Jacinto.
The man who wasn't there. Hermann Ehrenberg tells the stories of the Alamo and San Jacinto. Hermann Ehrenberg arrived in New York alone as a 17-year-old immigrant from Prussia in August of 1834. By mid-October of 1835, he was in Louisiana, where he signed up at a large public meeting as a volunteer with the New Orleans Braves, a unit which was critical to the Texan capture of San Antonio in early December. Though he slept for a few of the following nights at the Alamo, by the end of the month, he had left San Antonio along with many of his comrades in arms, intending to take part in a foolishly planned descent on Matamoros. However, he ended up instead at the Goliad Presidio under the shaky command of James Walker Fannin, who led his men in an ill-timed retreat during which they were surrounded, defeated, captured, and then imprisoned for a week in the Presidio before being let out to their wholesale slaughter. Through luck and pluck, Ehrenberg survived the massacre at Goliad and fled on foot once again alone as far east as the Colorado River, where he was recaptured by the Mexicans and put to work along with other Texan prisoners at the fort of Matagorda. It was here that he saw the Mexican army suddenly retreat in disarray upon word of their leader's disaster at San Jacinto. Although threatened with a forced removal to Mexico, Ehrenberg escaped a second time and found his way back to the protection of the victorious Texans. Given an honorable discharge in early June, he tried for the next 4 years to make his living as a merchant in the Texas Republic, but hard times led him to sign up for military service once more, this time in a ranging company organized in Houston in 1840. Though he saw no combat in his service near the new capital of Austin, he developed while camping on the frontier what he called a bowel complaint, which sent him first to New Orleans and then back to Europe for medical treatment. While living in the Prussian city of Halle in 1842, Herman composed a dramatic memoir of his adventures as a soldier in the Texas Revolution. It was published in nearby Leipzig in 1843 and went into second and third printings over the next 2 years, becoming the most popular book about Texas to be published in the German-speaking lands in the 1840s. It is the longest and most vivid account of the war by any Texan soldier, but it was virtually unknown in Texas and not fully translated, even poorly, into English until the 20th century. Ehrenberg was obviously not present at either the Battle of the Alamo or the Battle of San Jacinto, but his memoir is a remarkable sample, nevertheless, of the attitudes and opinions of the common man of the Texas Republic, about the Revolution in general, and about these two battles in particular. The central theme of his memoir is the superiority of the freedom-loving and hardworking Texans and North Americans generally to the servile and apathetic Mexicans. But his work also carried the constant reminder of his belief that a similar struggle for freedom and democracy was needed in Germany. Like so many young Germans of his time, he anticipated the precepts of what became the failed revolutions of 1848. But he departed Europe for North America soon after submitting his manuscript for publication. He sailed from Hamburg to New Orleans in the summer of 1843, and from there proceeded to St. Louis, took the Oregon Trail to the Pacific in the following year, and over the next 2 decades, lived a short but fulfilling lifetime of fame and at least some fortune in the American West before his tragic death in 1866. His chapters on the Alamo and San Jacinto contain an abundance of rumor, hyperbole, myth, and just plain falsehood. He witnessed neither battle, and there were no professional scholars around to set him straight. The late Texas historian Thomas Ricks Lindley dismissed Ehrenberg's Alamo narrative as nothing but lurid fiction. So why is it worth our attention? The prime reason is that this chapter contains the essence of the Texas creation myth, the story that the Anglo-Texans told themselves about who they were and what were their defining values and characteristics. It was a popular memory raised to the level of sacred myth that allowed their successful revolution to define their identity and that of generations of Texans to come. Historian Paul Andrew Hutton has described this Texas creation myth as a series of interrelated opposites, representing a holistic contrast, and indeed a contest of civilizations. The stories that embodied the myth contrasted freedom versus democracy, Protestantism versus Catholicism, the progressive culture of the United States versus the backward-looking culture of Mexico, Anglo-Saxons versus a mongrelized mixture of darker races, and ultimately, good versus evil. Any modern reader of Ehrenberg's memoir will recognize in his work each one of these invidious distinctions between Texas and Mexico, and they are almost all present in his story of the Battle of the Alamo. They are especially visible in his description of Santa Anna's army, which in his narrative of the earlier Texan capture of San Antonio, he had already compared unfavorably to the Democratic Army of the Texans, in which common soldiers elected their own officers, and every order was subject to the approval or disapproval of the subordinates. Conversely, Ehrenberg claims that many of the Mexican troops marched to Texas in chains, and while this was literally true for some of the reinforcements brought to San Antonio by the Mexicans in 1835, Herman's contemptuous description of an army of reluctant convicts forced to besiege the Alamo is clearly an overstatement, if not a lurid fiction, yet it contains more than a kernel of truth. Ehrenberg may exaggerate the total number of convict soldiers in the Mexican army, but not the number of involuntary conscripts. There were many. Only 3,500 troops were ready for Santa Anna's Texas expedition in March of 1835. But by the time the campaign began with the winter trek to the north, over 6,000 men were on hand. The majority of these were conscripts, forced into the ranks with no choice in the matter. Historian William DePaulo's study of the Mexican army during this period found that the Mexican state governments, from whose militias many of Santa Anna's troops were gathered, forcibly impressed vagrants, criminals, and sundry other misfits who were rounded up and shipped off to military encampments, some in chains, others incarcerated at each stop until reaching their final destination. Race and class played a large role in determining who was inducted against their will. Those unfortunate enough to be conscripted into the army, notes DePaulo, were mostly of Indian and mestizo racial extraction, and the coercive measures used to fill the ranks meant that the army came to resemble a large penal institution. Most of Mexico's citizens equated military induction with incarceration. The contrast with Herman Ehrenberg's democratic army could not have been greater. And to Ehrenberg, the contrast meant that the Mexican army embodied tyranny, despotism, old world, that is, anti-democratic values, and constituted a horde of half-Indians threatening the freedom and the freedoms of the Texans. Ehrenberg's anti-Mexican attitude extended to the people of San Antonio, whom he accused, without evidence, of attempting on Santa Anna's orders to treacherously poison the Alamo garrison. But his account of the siege and fall of the Alamo is more than a pack of prejudicial lies and fantasies. He is correct that it was the third wave of attacking Mexican troops in the dawn of March 6th that finally mounted the walls and poured into the undermanned fortress. Major Evans, the Texan that Herman pictures with a torch, attempting to blow up the powder magazine, was identified as such by Alamo survivor Susanna Dickinson in an article published in the Telegraph and Texas Register in March 1836, identified as Robert Evans, the master of ordnance for the Alamo, acting under previous orders from Colonel Travis. And Ehrenberg's story of a crazed defender jumping from the rooftop is corroborated by the Mexican officer Jose Enrique de la Peña, who recalls seeing an unfortunate father with a young son in his arms hurl himself from a considerable height, both perishing at the same blow. Enrique Esparza, who survived the Battle of the Alamo as a child inside the chapel with his mother, testified that one of the two sons brought into the Alamo by defender Anthony Wolf was grabbed by his father, and both of them leaped off the high chapel wall to their deaths. Whether true or false, these were stories of the Alamo circulating in the Texas Republic and heard by the young Herman Ehrenberg from 1836 to 1840. The most intriguing of Ehrenberg's tidbits of second or third hand Alamo history is his statement that only David Crockett and 6 other men were still fighting when the core of Santa Anna's troops came over the walls. No matter how we translate the German word Kern, which can mean heart or nucleus, in addition to core, this sentence makes little sense given what we know of the battle, as many of the Texan defenders fell back into their barracks or other rooms as the Mexicans began to pour into the compound. But it strangely resembles the statement made by Sam Houston in one of his last letters to James W. Fanning. Quote, after the Alamo fort was carried, 7 men surrendered and called for General Santa Anna in quarters. They were murdered by his order. End of quote. Almost immediately, as the word of the Alamo's fall traveled eastward, Other letter writers in both Gonzales and Washington on the Brazos repeated the same story. 7 Texans were killed immediately after asking for quarter and denied the chance to surrender. Within a month of the battle for the Alamo, David Crockett had been named as one of these 7. A report in the New Orleans True American on March 29th said that Crockett was one of the number who cried out for quarter, but were told there was no mercy for them. But even this report, like several others, had made no mention at all of an attempted surrender and claimed that Crockett and his 6 companions died fighting, as the Texan officer Andrew Briscoe put it, like a tiger. It was only after Mexican soldiers and their companions, those who had actually seen the summary executions following the fighting at the Alamo, only after these Mexicans began to record their own versions of the event, that a more complete story than that told by either Ehrenberg or Houston began to emerge. The first mention of an attempt by a Mexican General Manuel Castrillon to spare the lives of a half dozen or so Mexican defenders, including Crockett, at the conclusion of the battle, came in a letter written from Galveston Island by an American newspaper correspondent on June 9, 1836. A Mexican prisoner of war stated true of the reporter that the last 6 surviving defenders were surrounded and ordered by General Castrillon to surrender under a promise of protection. Marching the men up to Santa Anna, Castrillon asked, "How shall I dispose of them?" Santa Anna flew into a violent rage and demanded to know why Castrillon was bringing prisoners to him against specific orders to the contrary. Immediately, Santa Anna's other officers plunged their swords into the bosoms of the defenseless prisoners. A similar account, most likely emanating from the same unnamed prisoner on Galveston Island, was written on July 19th, but not published in a Detroit newspaper until September of 1836. In a letter written to his brother in Michigan by George M. Dolson, the bilingual Texan sergeant told of the debriefing of a prisoner who told of General Castrillon's delivery of Crockett and 5 other prisoners to Santa Anna with the request that they be spared. Livid, Santa Anna berated Castrillon for his insubordination and watched as his more servile officers dispatched the captives within 6 feet of the Generalissimo's person. While the Dolson letter has come under intense scrutiny and has been labeled by some as nonsensical, a careful analysis of its contents reveals evidence that Dolson was indeed relating the results of his translation of the prisoner's Spanish language testimony. The Dolson letter was not discovered by historians and published in a scholarly journal until 1960. By that time, yet another Mexican account had appeared, written as a memoir by Lieutenant Colonel Jose Enrique de la Peña, but not published in Mexico until 1955 and appearing in English only in 1975. In what became in the late 20th and early 21st centuries the most controversial single account of Crockett's death, this Mexican officer wrote to Santa Anna, indignant at Castrillon's intervention on 7 survivors' behalf, ordered that they be shot, but that when the soldiers who received his orders hesitated, other officers stepped forward and with swords in hand fell upon these unfortunate defenseless men just as a tiger leaps upon his prey. De la Peña identified only one of the slain, David Crockett. The Dolson letter was not widely publicized in the 1830s, and the De la Peña memoir lay hidden until the mid-20th century. But there was one important confirmation of Castrillon's role in the execution of Crockett and the Alamo captives that was potentially available to the citizens of the Texas Republic. The memoir of Ramon Martinez Caro, the civilian private secretary of Santa Anna himself. In a book published in Mexico City in 1837, Martinez Caro stated that after finding 5 men hiding after the assault, Castrillon took the prisoners immediately to Santa Anna. When he presented his captives, he was severely reprimanded for not having killed them on the spot. after which Santa Anna turned his back upon Castrillon while the soldiers stepped out of their ranks and set upon the prisoners until they were killed. Though the eyewitness account of Martinez Caro did not appear in English until 1928, we know for a fact that Castrillon's attempt to preserve the lives of Crockett and the other Alamo captives was recognized in Texas during the Decade of Independence. The proof, on August 30th, 1843, around the same time that Ehrenberg's book was being published in Leipzig, a brief recollection by an officer of the Texan Army titled Random Sketches of the Revolution appeared in the Houston Telegraph and Texas Register, the premier newspaper of the young republic. After singling out a Mexican officer at the Battle of San Jacinto for his stoic bravery in the face of death, the Texan said that this Mexican officer is more particularly noticed as it was afterwards known he was the noble and generous Colonel Castellon who wished to save the life of Crockett at the fall of the Alamo. So with his garbled account of the last 7 surviving defenders at the Alamo, who almost certainly included David Crockett, Herman Ehrenberg was actually onto a fascinating and important story, but he didn't know the half of it. In the opening paragraph of Ehrenberg's chapter on San Jacinto, he tells us that General Santa Anna was so busy burning and pillaging the Texas colonies that he didn't notice Sam Houston and his Texan army lurking just across Buffalo Bayou from him as he torched the makeshift Texan capital of Harrisburg. There is some truth in this statement, but Ehrenberg's timing was off. Let's take a closer look. Although the Texans themselves burned the town of Gonzales and San Felipe de Austin and the supplies therein, in the midst of the retreat of Houston's army, Santa Anna was certainly burning and pillaging with gusto after he crossed the Brazos. While at the Fort Bend crossing, the Mexican general was told that the Texan government had relocated from Washington on the Brazos to Harrisburg. Immediately, Santa Anna and 600 of his troops set out on a 30-mile march to seize the rebel chieftains. Leaving at 4 in the afternoon on April 14th, the Mexicans pushed on after sunset, wandering in the mud and dark until finally stopping midway to their destination at 9 o'clock. Colonel Pedro Delgado described the next day's activities. On the 15th, at 8 o'clock, most of the stragglers having joined, we started again. At about noon, we reached a plantation abundantly supplied with corn, meal, sheep, and hogs. It had a good garden and a fine cotton gin. We halted to refresh men and beasts. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, having set fire to the dwelling and the gin houses, we resumed our march. Santa Anna, with Delgado, the rest of his senior staff, and a cavalry escort, set out at a brisk trot and reached Harrisburg by 11 o'clock that evening. They captured 2 printers who were desperately trying to get out the latest issue of the Telegraph and Texas Register. The Mexicans tossed the printing press into Buffalo Bayou, but not before learning that the Texan president and his cabinet had left only a few hours earlier for the Galveston Bay port of New Washington. While Santa Anna spent the next day in Harrisburg, awaiting the arrival of his infantry and another parade of stragglers, he dispatched Colonel Juan Almonte to New Washington with the cavalry to catch the rebel politicians. And he sent Colonel Delgado, along with other troops, across a nearby bayou for some more looting and burning. There was a portent of dangerous things to come, however. Again, in the words of Delgado, we found 2 or 3 houses well supplied with wearing apparel, mainly for women's use, fine furniture, an excellent piano, jars of preserves, chocolate, fruit, etc., all of which were appropriated for the benefit of His Excellency and his attendants. I and others obtained only what they could not use. After the houses had been sacked and burnt down, A party of Americans fired upon our men from the woods. It is wonderful that some of us, camped as we were along the bank of the bayou, were not killed. The quartermaster sergeant of Matamoros was seriously wounded. This incident took place at 5:00 p.m. Still in no hurry, and leaving at Almonte to capture the civil officers of the fragile Texas Republic, Santa Anna finally departed at 3:00 on the 17th for New Washington, having instructed Delgado to burn Harrisburg to the ground. It was not until the next day, April 18th, that Sam Houston and his army, after a 2.5-day forced march of 55 miles from Jerry Gross's plantation on the Upper Brazos, reached Buffalo Bayou opposite Harrisburg. This is the likely location from which Delgado had been surprised by gunfire from hidden Americans the day before. The men who shot at Delgado from the woods may well have been some of Houston's advance guard. The Texan general was routinely receiving information from scouts and spies who were monitoring Mexican movements. Ehrenberg says that Santa Anna did not notice Houston's army across the bayou, but the Mexican general had left the area the day before Houston's arrival. Santa Anna seemed to be not particularly concerned about the Texas Army's location, or even apparently about the odd bullets that had been fired at his troops from the trees the previous day. At New Washington, Colonel Almonte had barely missed capturing the Texan officials as their rowboat headed out to the flat-bottomed schooner Flash, waiting for them in the bay to take them to Galveston Island. But Santa Anna was still in no hurry. Arriving at New Washington on the 18th, he spent the next day seeing his troops fed with beef obtained from local cattle herds and sending Captain Marcos Barragan and a detachment of horsemen out to see if they could discern Houston's movements. Historian Stephen Hardin notes that although Santa Anna had received reports that Houston was heading along with escaping Texas families towards Nacogdoches, Colonel Almonte's scouts had heard that Houston was taking a more southerly route eastward, heading for the Trinity River by way of the Lynchburg Ferry, which was located at the point where Buffalo Bayou and the San Jacinto River flowed into Galveston Bay. Martinez Cotto, Santa Anna's civilian secretary, reports that the Mexican commander was already planning to cross the San Jacinto River at Lynchburg in order to continue to the port of Anahuac. From the time that Urrea defeated Fanning and captured his men, Santa Anna considered the war in Texas virtually over and planned to leave for Tampico from some Texas port, such as Copano or Matagorda, at the opportune time. But now, with Houston perhaps closer than expected, Santa Anna's goal would certainly be to reach the Lynchburg ferry before Houston could do so. By early morning on the 20th, says Colonel Delgado, all the major structures in New Washington having been looted and burned, the army was ready to move out when Captain Barragan rushed in at full speed, reporting that Houston was close on our rear and that his troops had captured some of our stragglers and had disarmed and dispatched them. Immediately, Santa Anna ordered a rapid march toward Lynchburg, telling his men to drop their knapsacks in the road to be picked up later. They arrived by midday, only to find Houston's pickets guarding the woods which stood between the Mexicans and the Lynchburg ferry. Santa Anna's stragglers weren't the only enemies that had been picked up by Houston's scouts. On April 18th, they had also intercepted a Mexican courier and his escort just west of Harrisburg, carrying dispatches in deerskin saddlebags embossed with the words William Barrett Travis, saddlebags that had obviously been captured in the Alamo. The messengers revealed that Santa Anna was now at New Washington with a small force, isolated from the rest of the Mexican army. Armed with this vital information, Houston and his troops crossed over Buffalo Bayou on a makeshift raft throughout the next day, and after a brief rest in the middle of the night, pushed on towards Lynchburg in time to beat Santa Anna to the crossing. They found there and captured a Mexican flatboat filled with provisions that had been sent ahead from New Washington for His Excellency's use. Breakfast on the morning of the 20th was especially tasty for the Texans. Ehrenberg is a bit confused about the skirmishing that took place at San Jacinto that afternoon. While it is unclear which side fired the first shot, there is no doubt that there was an indecisive artillery duel between the twin sisters, the two 6-pounders from Cincinnati that had been delivered to Houston at Gross's, and the Mexican 12-pounder that General Manuel Castrillon had been tasked with bringing up behind Santa Anna's swift advance. Ehrenberg is mistaken in stating that the big gun was brought to the battlefield by General Koss on the 21st. Moreover, Herman fails to mention the limited cavalry and infantry feints and retreats that also took place on the previous day at San Jacinto. But the bottom line is what didn't happen on April 20th. What didn't happen is more important than what did. What Sam Houston did with great difficulty was to hold back his overeager men from a precipitous full-scale attack on the Mexican position, an attack that would have lost both the element of surprise and the defensive protection that the wooded bank along Buffalo Bayou provided his troops. On the other hand, Ehrenberg is essentially accurate in portraying the devastating effect on the Mexicans of the next day's late afternoon surprise attack by the Texans. He is also correct that Bet Smith's destruction of Vince's Bridge, the name of which Herman did not know, turned out to be critically important. This was a bridge spanning Vince's Bayou, a small but formidable barrier to easy travel, which 4 army groups had recently crossed. Almonte and the cavalry as they rushed to New Washington, Santa Anna as he moved more slowly from Harrisburg to New Washington, Houston after his men had crossed Buffalo Bayou on their way to Lynchburg, and General Koss as he brought reinforcements to Santa Anna on the morning of the April 21st. Destroying the bridge, in addition to cutting off the route of retreat for either army that might be defeated at San Jacinto, meant that more Mexican reinforcements could not easily follow Koss and strengthen Santa Anna before the battle. As it turned out, such reinforcements were not on the way, but the destruction of the bridge was crucial in preventing the escape of Santa Anna as his army melted around him. What Ehrenberg did not understand with regard to the Mexican army's flight from the battlefield is that the infantry had absolutely no chance of following their retreating cavalry's dash around the Texan right flank and toward the now bridgeless Vince's Bayou. The foot soldiers instead retreated backwards, directly away from the oncoming Texan infantry, and ran smack into Peggy's Lake and the marshes that surrounded the east and south sides of Santa Anna's ill-chosen position. These boggy waters are where much of the great slaughter occurred that produced more than 600 Mexican deaths and contributed to the capture of more than 700 of Santa Anna's men. The Texan cavalry, on the other hand, had turned west almost immediately to pursue the fleeing Mexican horsemen, including Santa Anna. There is no way that the Mexican infantry could have been a part of this deadly chase, as Ehrenberg claims they were. Both Mexican and Texan eyewitnesses to this race toward the site of the demolished bridge recount the many mounted Mexicans who were caught and killed by Texan horsemen before they could reach even the fearful disappointment of the unusable bridge. But the Mexican infantrymen were slaughtered elsewhere. There was indeed a great deal of death inflicted at San Jacinto, almost all of it by the enraged and almost uncontrollable Texans, lusting for revenge for the massacres and executions at Goliad and the Alamo. The war did not begin this way. The Mexicans who survived the siege of Bexar in December 1835 were paroled and sent safely to the Rio Grande. Yet Santa Anna falsely claimed in that month, even before Koss had surrendered at Bexar and before Santa Anna had reached Texas, that the Texans had audaciously declared a war of extermination against the Mexicans and should be treated in the same manner. We have seen, through Herman Ehrenberg's own eyes, the results of Santa Anna's grim orders to execute the prisoners at Goliad. The late historian Jack Jackson has made a powerful case that if Santa Anna was not literally planning on destroying all traces of the heretics in Texas, as Ehrenberg claims, the Mexican commander-in-chief was nevertheless determined to rule a newly Mexicanized Texas with a firm hand. According to Jackson, the plan was to occupy and populate the land, avoiding the repeat of the fiasco that occurred with North American colonists in Texas. Yet General Vicente Filosola was even more blunt about Santa Anna's plans, after noting that His Excellency had instructed his subordinate generals, Correa, Gaona, and Sesma, to execute all prisoners. Filosola added that these commanders were also to drive out of the country all those not actively engaged in the war. But things turned out very differently. Historians Craig Rail and Harvard Davenport agreed that Santa Anna made a fatal mistake when he ordered the executions at Goliad, turning what could have been an embarrassment for the revolutionists in Texas and their supporters into a desperate determination to fight to the death in retaliation for his cruelty. The same claim might be made for the executions at the Alamo, though only a half dozen men rather than close to 400 were cut down there in cold blood. The brilliant Haitian-born historian Michel Rolfe Trujillo has argued that in important ways, Santa Anna was doubly defeated at San Jacinto. He lost the battle of the day, but he also lost the battle that he had won at the Alamo. What Trujillo asserts is that Houston's men doubly made history, both as actors and as narrators. Said Trujillo, they gave the Alamo story a new meaning. It was the Texans, including Herman Ehrenberg, who narrated the ultimate story of victory, not Santa Anna. What had been the Mexican chieftain's ostensibly glorious victory at Bear was turned into a heroic but doomed defense by the vanquished Texans, and a mere prelude to Santa Anna's humiliating defeat by men whom he held in contempt, but who were determined to avenge their fallen comrades. Yes, Ehrenberg missed the battles of the Alamo and San Jacinto, but like the great majority of his fellow Texan citizens, he thought he knew what these battles meant. That whatever the privations of independence, Texans were destined for a greatness that they had earned and that they fully deserved.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. So our final speaker today is Dr. Sam Haynes. He's a professor of history at the University of Texas at Arlington. He specializes in 19th century Texas and American Southwest. He's the author of 3 books. He's an inductee of the Texas Institute of Letters, and he served as a consultant for PBS and the History Channel. He's currently the Bill and Rita Clements Senior Research Fellow at the Clements Center for Southwest Studies. And one of my favorite books is Contested Empire, Rethinking the Texas Revolution, which he co-edited with Gerald Saxon. His topic today is Monument and Memory in Texas History, from Sacred Ground to Martial Symbol. His approach is to give us some insight on how prominent women in the late 19th and early 20th century interpreted the Texas Revolution, and how that interpretation and their preservation efforts helped shape the public understanding of these events, and how that narrative changed over time and influenced heritage tourism in the late 20th century. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sam Haynes.
want to start my talk by showing you a photograph of the San Jacinto Monument. Now, this probably wasn't the image you were expecting, but in fact, for almost 60 years, it was the San Jacinto Monument. Built to commemorate the 9 Anglo men who died at San Jacinto, it's now called the Brigham Monument. And that's simply because Benjamin Brigham's name came first alphabetically. It's on the San Jacinto grounds near the battleship Texas. The Brigham Monument is a good starting point because I want to discuss the way our understanding of Texas history has evolved. Historians, of course, are always rewriting and revising the past. But the popular narrative, the one that the general public is familiar with, changes too, and in fundamental ways. And today, I want to take a look at the role that gender plays in this process. When we think of early 19th century Texas history, we tend to see it as a male-centered narrative, one in which Anglo-American men, Austin, Houston, Travis, and so on, hold center stage. And that's always been true. But in the late 19th century, the popular narrative of Texas history was crafted largely by women. And they told a story that differed in many respects from the one that became popular in the 20th century, when the narrative slowly passed into the hands of men. Put simply, men and women do not always find the same meaning in historical events. And that's certainly true of the Texas Revolution. In the late 19th century, the commemoration of the state's history was almost exclusively a female activity. And this was a natural role for women in the Progressive era. Traditionally, the task of tending to the grave sites of family members had been left to wives and mothers. With most professional occupations closed to them, they gravitated to pursuits such as historical preservation and commemoration as they looked for ways to enlarge their role in the public sphere. If middle-class women could not play a significant role in a family's economic position, they could at least help to preserve a family's standing in society by drawing attention to the achievements of their forebears. Social status was a prominent motivator for many women who joined the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, which was established in 1891. This desire to preserve and remember the past wasn't unique to Texas, by the way. It was a national phenomenon. It's during this period that we see the emergence of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which built monuments to Confederate heroes. And of course, that's been in the news quite a bit lately. The Daughters of the American Revolution also gets its start at this time. 1891 was also the year elite women in San Antonio first commemorated the Battle of San Jacinto by organizing a parade of carriages decorated with wreaths, garlands, and flowers. The parade ended in Alamo Plaza, where they threw flowers at one another, a tradition that became known as the Battle of Flowers. So what exactly did the DRT do? It devoted much of its energies to education, an occupation that was open to women during this time. It won legislative approval to make Texas history a required course in public schools. It sponsored student essay contests. It renamed hundreds of public schools for Texas heroes. It promoted genealogical research and worked to secure state ownership of Texas battlefields. But unlike a historical organization we might think of today, DRT chapters saw their role as custodians of public memory as a sacred one. Just as their tending to the graves of deceased family members had carried spiritual meaning, the Daughters regarded the task of commemorating the heroic moments of the past in quasi-religious terms. Thus, the battlefields they sought to protect were, in a very real sense, hallowed ground. DRT meetings involved elaborate catechisms and rituals. The artifacts they acquired for local museums they called relics. Even the birthplace of the DRT, a small home in Galveston, was seen as a sacred space and is still known today as the cradle. Although historical commemoration was left to women during this period, the Daughters did seek out male sanction, as they did during their annual meetings, when an outside speaker was invited to address the group. In the organization's early years, this task usually fell to an officer of the Texas Veterans Association. As their ranks dwindled, the DRT called upon prominent politicians or businessmen. The speeches of men and women at these meetings bring out in bold relief the gendered constructions of remembrance. In their own remarks, DRT leaders sought to present the story of the revolution as a lesson in patriotism and civic responsibility. Anglo-Texan leaders who had called upon colonists to sacrifice their lives, most notably men like Ben Milam and William Barrett Travis, claimed a special place of honor in the DRT's pantheon of heroes. Others were seen as standard bearers of Anglo-American progress, like Stephen F. Austin and Mirabeau Lamar, celebrated as the father of Texas education. By contrast, the white males who addressed the group on these occasions chose to highlight acts of valor. Like the DRT, they extolled the familiar virtues of heroism, but they were less interested in self-sacrifice, more inclined to dwell on acts of bravery and military prowess. They tended to focus, too, on the revolution's geopolitical consequences, something the daughters rarely mentioned. San Jacinto, for example, came to be seen as a pivotal moment in the Anglo-American advance across the continent, a battle which had significance not just for Texas, but for the nation as a whole. As you may already know, there was a very public spat within the DRT over the preservation of the Alamo. The controversy has often been cast in ethnic and, to a lesser degree, class terms, which pitted ranching heiress Clara Driscoll against Tejana schoolteacher Adina de Zavala. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but I think the struggle, as much as anything else, was one between two competing progressive impulses: the historical preservation movement and the city beautiful movement. And in both of those movements, women played a prominent role. In an era which saw the restoration of Paul Revere's home in Boston and Washington's Mount Vernon, Zavala was committed to preserving the entire Alamo complex, including the Long Barracks, which had been converted into a general store in the 1880s. Driscoll, on the other hand, had no interest in restoring the site to its condition at the time of the siege, and wanted the Long Barracks leveled to create a city park anchored by the Alamo Chapel. Now, if you're familiar with this controversy, then you know that Driscoll, who had far more clout with prominent business leaders and the legislature, ultimately prevailed. Zavala was drummed out of the DRT, and here you can see Adina in the background. She went on to form the Texas Historical and Landmarks Association, which played a key role in historical preservation in San Antonio. Although Zavala was certainly the better historian, Driscoll's view was much more in tune with the DRT's focus on the sacred nature of historical commemoration. A devout Catholic, Driscoll viewed the distinct Alamo Chapel as an iconic symbol of Texas independence, but it was also something more, a symbol of the self-sacrifice and moral uplift that was so much a part of the group's late Victorian worldview. Thanks to Clara Driscoll, it's known as the Shrine of Texas Liberty. That's why you're still asked to remove your hat when you enter the chapel. To further promote the Alamo as a sacred site, DRT members organized what became known as the Pilgrimage, a solemn procession from downtown San Antonio to the Alamo by candlelight, an event that still survives as part of the city's annual fiesta celebrations. It's really not until the 20th century that men start to take an interest in historical commemoration. And they do so for a pretty simple reason. With the rise of tourism, men saw that history could be big business. San Antonio civic leaders briefly considered an Alamo Heroes Monument that would help to promote their city, much like the Eiffel Tower had done for Paris. They envisioned an 800-foot structure that would include restaurants and offices. If you're wondering where the Alamo is, it's right here. Fortunately, the ambitious project never got off the drawing board. After World War I, tourism was no longer an elite pastime, but a ritual of citizenship for all Americans, the result of the combined efforts of civic boosters, railroads, and the automobile industry. Through media campaigns and travel guidebooks, an iconographic shorthand emerged as Americans began to know their country by its landmarks and landforms. It's during this period that we see popular memory used to define American regional identities. New Mexico had its Pueblo villages. The South had its plantation homes. California had its Spanish missions. These are all part of this phenomenon. And this posed a problem for Texas as a tourist destination. Just what exactly did Texas have to promote? The sprawling state was too big to be identified by a single geographic feature, like Arizona's mesas, while heritage tourism required a unique built environment. Texas had a few Spanish missions, of course, but they were all in San Antonio. You couldn't see them anywhere else in the state. A New York newspaperman, Theodore Price, had an answer to this dilemma. In a speech to a gathering of advertising executives in 1923, he suggested that the state focus on what he called its glorious romantic history. Now, Price wasn't an historian, and he didn't know much about Texas history. All he knew, really, was that it had been a frontier at one time. Of course, the frontier era didn't last very long, and there wasn't much left of it to see. And that, as it turns out, seems to have been something of a blessing in disguise. If Texans couldn't point to a tangible history, they were free to craft and imagine one. Whereas tourism in other regions was built upon a visible past, a physical or a built environment. In Texas, the frontier existed simply as an organizing framework. Its mythic history became a jumble of familiar archetypes, a pastiche of rugged pioneers, a ragtag army of Texians fighting Mexico, cowboys on the open range, and so on. The story of Texas now became less about a chain of events and more about what might be called a frontiering spirit. In the early 1930s, momentum began to build for a celebration to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of Texas independence, which would promote the state and bring in much-needed tourist dollars. I don't think you can overstate the importance of the campaign to rebrand Texas in 1936 and its impact in fashioning the historical narrative that is so familiar to us today. Such an effort could only have been undertaken during the New Deal. It required the marshaling of human resources on an unprecedented scale, a partnership of the public and private sectors working collectively to craft a new image for the state. And I think the centennial serves as an inflection point where DRT and other women's groups, where their control of the historical narrative begins to slip away. There was some effort to consult women's groups. Half of the 22-member Texas Centennial Commission were women. Clara Driscoll was one. But the group was quickly relegated to honorary blue ribbon status as power devolved upon the all-male Board of Control, which alone allocated state funding for centennial events. A three-man advisory board of historians came up with a list of monuments and historical markers, but snubbed Adina de Zavala, who offered her services as a consultant. More importantly, it soon became clear that the DRT and male business leaders had very different views about key moments in the state's past. The DRT saw Texas history as a linear narrative, with the state passing through several phases. Just as they celebrated the pioneer phase, they also acknowledged the antebellum era that followed. Actually, many DRT members were also members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and they were proud of the state's Southern heritage. A women's centennial committee in one city proposed building a fully functional plantation home staffed by Southern belles, with African Americans performing Negro spirituals. The Southern Women's Memorial Association commissioned a statue of Robert E. Lee for a public park in Dallas. But elsewhere, the Texas role in the Confederacy merited barely a footnote in centennial observances. Male business leaders had no interest in emphasizing the state's Southern roots. By the 1930s, the South had become an economic backwater, lagging far behind the rest of the nation. Instead of dwelling on the Civil War and the fight to defend slavery, they embraced the image of the pioneer, but not for nostalgic reasons, but as a forward-looking symbol of progress. The cowboy, too, occupied a central place in the narrative, a figure who connected the past to the present, as well as the future. The tension between these two very different gendered narratives is best illustrated in the way the state's four largest cities, San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, and Fort Worth, celebrated the centennial. In Houston and San Antonio, cities that could claim a connection to the events of 1836, the DRT did manage to maintain some degree of control in shaping the narrative. In keeping with Clara Driscoll's vision of the Alamo Chapel as a sacred ecumenical symbol, the DRT invited the Archbishop of San Antonio to deliver High Mass in Alamo Plaza before a crowd of 20,000 people, flanked on the dais by nuns, priests, and novices. They were followed by Protestant ministers, rabbis, the UDC, the DAR, and other civic groups. 6 weeks later, a similar ceremony took place at the San Jacinto Battleground, with 2,000 children choreographed to form a Texas flag that morphed on cue into the Stars and Stripes. Beneath an enormous canopy erected on the site where the monument would later stand, 26 bishops conducted a field mass before a crowd of almost 100,000 people. This was the largest crowd ever assembled in Texas at that time. NBC Radio broadcast the event live to the nation. There was no emphasis whatsoever on the sacred character of these events in the celebrations that took place in Dallas and Fort Worth. The centerpiece of the centennial program was the World's Fair, hosted by Dallas. Why was Dallas chosen? The city didn't even exist in 1836. Simply because Dallas business leaders easily outbid San Antonio and Houston for the right to hold the fair. They were determined to promote the city as a mecca of economic progress. The dilapidated state fairgrounds south of town were transformed into a gleaming air-conditioned complex of Art Deco buildings. As in previous fairs, corporate sponsorship helped offset construction costs. General Electric was an underwriter for the Hall of Electricity. General Motors sponsored the Hall of Transportation. The story of the state's independence from Mexico was sidelined in the push to show that Dallas, in the middle of the Depression, was open for business. But it was the centennial observances in Fort Worth where the decline of women as custodians of the state's history could be seen most clearly. Although better known as a meatpacking center than a stopover for cattle drives, in recent years, Fort Worth had embraced its cowtown identity, holding an annual stock show that traded on the cowboy life popularized in dime novels and films. Fort Worth's counterfeit cowboy image was personified by this man, Amon Carter, who was something of a drugstore cowboy himself, a traveling salesman before establishing a local media empire. He was credited with giving the town its famous nickname, Where the West Begins, placing the slogan on the masthead of his newspaper, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. In the early planning stages of the Frontier Centennial in Fort Worth, there appeared to be every indication that the city's club women would play a prominent role. The Fort Worth Women's Club looked forward to providing visitors with a taste of the city's heritage, establishing a raft of committees to create historical exhibits. The group proposed to clothe female greeters at the fairgrounds in period costume, as you can see in this photo. But that would change when Amon Carter hired New York impresario Billy Rose to direct the Fort Worth celebration. A Barnum-esque showman, Rose viewed the exposition's frontier motif as little more than a vehicle around which to frame a New York-style extravaganza. The event drew from a range of frontier and Old West tropes to create a themed space without regard to time and place. The entrance to the Midway included a Republic-era frontier fort, and that led visitors into a generic Western boomtown with a saloon and dance hall, blacksmith shop, hitching posts, and so on. Rose sharply reduced the role of Fort Worth women's groups. He gave them a small museum to run. And they were horrified, to put it mildly, by his use of female sexuality as part of the Centennial's marketing strategy. In recent years, such fairs had tested the norms of propriety offering burlesque entertainment on the Midway to a male audience, and the Fort Worth Fair was no exception. Miss Fort Worth, seen here, became the iconic symbol of the exposition. Rose also hired 150 showgirls from New York City and signed Sally Rand, whose fan dance had caused a sensation at the recent Chicago World's Fair. Here's a picture of Sally Rand's Nude Ranch Review. Fun fact, the performers were wearing flesh-colored body stockings. There was only so much you could get away with in Fort Worth in 1936, apparently. More enduring than the centennial celebrations themselves was the federally sponsored monument building program. Unlike the statues erected by women's clubs of the Progressive period that could be found in cemeteries, city parks, and courthouse squares, centennial projects dominated the civic landscape. The WPA would oversee an extensive public works program to memorialize the revolution and the history of the state, reconstructing forts, placing hundreds of historical markers, and commissioning the construction of 20 statues. But only one of those statues commemorated the role of women, the rather generic pioneer woman, which can be seen at Texas Women's University in Benton. The driving force behind the construction of the San Jacinto Monument was Houstonian Jesse Jones, then serving as head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. For Jones, who shared the view of men who had addressed the DRT in its early years, the construction project was an opportunity to finally establish San Jacinto as one of the most decisive battles in history. Famously disregarding WPA guidelines that it should be shorter than the Washington Monument, Jones added the star to make it 15 feet taller, and in so doing, elevated the Texas Rebellion to a position alongside Washington's own revolution against Great Britain. The San Jacinto Monument took 3 years to build, and the United States was a very different place in 1939. By that time, the nation's attention had shifted from the Depression to the specter of war in Europe. The story of the revolution, etched into the friezes along the base of the monument, now hinted at a new set of contemporaneous concerns. Whereas earlier narratives had emphasized Anglo-American cultural superiority in the contest with Mexico, by 1939, the roots of the conflict were attributed to unscrupulous and despotic leaders, that's Santa Anna, of course, who now became a useful stand-in for modern dictators. One panel, the one you see here, lists the many states and countries the rebels came from, leaving no doubt that totalitarian aggression could only be defeated by a broad multinational alliance. The monument reflected growing geopolitical concerns in other ways too. Amid the need for allies to combat fascist aggression, FDR's good neighbor policy took on heightened significance. In 1941, the directors of the San Jacinto Museum unveiled an ambitious plan to establish a repository for Latin American archives, to make it a research center that would promote hemispheric cooperation. The irony of making San Jacinto a symbol of Mexican national humiliation, a site of Pan-American solidarity, was apparently lost on the board of directors. In any case, the plan was shelved amid budget cutbacks as the nation mobilized for war. As citizens of the world's preeminent military power after 1945, Americans grew much more accustomed to a muscular defense of their ideals. And Texas' fight for independence now seemed to hold lessons for the nation as a whole. Invited male speakers at the ceremonies, held each year at the Alamo in San Jacinto, held up the Texas Rebellion as an object lesson in the struggle for freedom as they invade against godless communism and other perceived threats to the United States. So when the US Navy decommissioned the battleship Texas in 1948, the state park seemed a perfectly logical choice for the vessel's permanent home. The San Jacinto battlefield's transformation as a symbol of American military power was complete. By the post-war period, the popular historical narrative had become tailored to appeal exclusively to white men. The call to sacrifice issued by William Barrett Travis and Ben Milo that had once resonated so powerfully with club women of the Progressive era would still be part of the story in the 1950s. But with the onset of the Cold War, With the narrative firmly in the hands of men, a cult of hypermasculinity focused greater attention on the Alamo's alpha males. Davy Crockett swinging old Betsy, Jim Bowie with his enormous knife. Virile champions of the Anglo-American frontier, they projected an image of strength, ready to save Texas, which in movies of the period often seemed inhabited only by helpless, dark-eyed senoritas from a tyrannical foe. We've come to accept this male-dominated narrative over the years, so thoroughly, in fact, that we've lost sight of how the story has changed since it was constructed by women. So when we think of the battle reenactors of the Alamo, let's not forget the first reenactors, in a very weird way, were the ladies at the Battle of Flowers. And we've all seen how this period of Texas history can be used as a marketing tool. The masculine imagery associated with the Alamo has been employed to sell all manner of products to men, mostly beer and cigarettes, actually. But there was a time when the Alamo siege was considered an appropriate vehicle to reach female consumers. And so finally, when we think of the San Jacinto Monument as a tribute to American military achievement, we shouldn't forget that this was a view that did not figure prominently in the way progressive women saw the battle. Their own monument was a memorial in the truest sense of the word, a site of remembrance for the 9 Americans who had died there in 1836.
Very good. Thank you so much, Sam. All right, we have now finished all the speakers. If you're a teacher, please write this down. There, you have a CPE code. It's BEXAR 2021, B, capital B, EXAR 2021. And what you'll need to do is email your name and the school you teach at and that code to Lisa Berg, that's LISA dot BERG at tshaonline.org. So I hope you got that. I'll try to put that up on the screen here as we transition now to our speakers. I think we've got most of them here, if not all of them, assembled. And we've got a few questions coming in. Okay, put that in the chat, I've been told. All right. If I can figure out how to do that, I will.
I've got it, Mr. Dunn.
Okay, you'll do it. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we do have a couple of questions here, and I'd like to start and ask our speakers one kind of overriding question. And that is, do you have anything to add or elaborate on your presentation? Or do you have any comments on any of the other speakers' presentations? Anybody?
Well, I would like to say that we continue to find in old material, whether it's visual, as we just saw with Sam's presentations, or with documents, we continue to find nuggets of if not exactly new information, at least innovative ways of interpreting that information. And so I've been doing some work also with postcards from the Alamo, not from San Jacinto, but from the Alamo. And it's very interesting to see how they change over time. So equally, it's interesting to see in some of Sam's visuals during his presentation that that change over time is not just the way that we talk about it, but also the way we view it. And in this visual world that we're in today, it has become so much more important. So that for those of us who deal with a period of time in which there are such few visual images that can help us frame the events, it becomes all the more important to go back and look at them carefully to see if we can ferret out something that will assist us in the way that we explain those events. I don't know if I'm making myself very clear, but I just think that visual materials, wherever they can be found, can help us relate what we're seeing in the documents and the interpretations that we're making about those documents.
Right. That's a very good point. And I will say that one of the great benefits of the internet is it has opened up a huge world of ability to access documents that were not really accessible even as recently as 10, 15 years ago. The portal to Texas history is a treasure trove of information, as well as all of the other online databases. And as we move forward, nuggets of information will come out that will be interpreted and help shape the how we view these events through the years. One thing I think we could agree upon is that these events are constantly being reinterpreted as time goes on. Anybody else? Any other speaker want to comment on either your topic or somebody else's?
I can just give a
Jim?
example. I can give an example to reinforce what you, Jeff, and Frank, you just said. 2 days ago, I just came across a design for the Mexican cannon used at San Jacinto, the golden standard. It was in the, it's online from the Archive of the Indies in Sevilla. And it's an 1878 design of that cannon from the Royal Army in Mexico City. And I've been researching these things for a long time. I just found out 3 days ago. So that's a perfect example of what you're talking about.
I could add one thing to that. We didn't discover when Herman Ehrenberg came back to the United States until September of last year, as I was doing corrections for the book because of a misdated document in the Asheville Smith papers. We always assumed he came back in 1844 and never found him. But I just decided two things. One, I wouldn't filter for years. And secondly, that I would look at New Orleans because that was clearly his favorite city in all the world. And it took me 20 minutes using the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon archives with the National Archives to find Herman Ehrenberg arriving from Hamburg to New Orleans in the summer of 1843. And throughout my work over 28 years on Ehrenberg, more and more and more materials became searchable and available. It helps to be searching someone named Herman Ehrenberg and not John Smith if you're going through millions of documents. I would just say one other thing in praise of the other four speakers, and that is that the variety of approaches and information that came from the decision to look at myths and misconceptions was just amazing. New information, interesting information, information from a lot of different perspectives. It's really been one of the most well-rounded of the San Jacinto Symposia that I've heard, and I've heard them all.
That's true.
Thank you, Jim.
Anybody else? Okay, I got a couple of specific questions here. First one is for Jim Woodward. What cannons are in front of the state capitol, the ones that some are trying to remove?
Immediately in front of the state capitol on either side of, I guess it would be the south entrance door to the state capitol, there are two short howitzers that were part of that group that Thomas Jefferson Chambers arranged for. I mentioned he arranged for 6 guns. 2 of those were little 10-inch howitzers that have been recovered, and they're now on either side of the front door of the Capitol. There are other cannons out in the yard, most of which are Confederate cannons, but these 2 were Texas Republic related.
Very good. And I got a follow-up. This is my question, you and I have corresponded about this, but the name Golden Standard
Yes.
on the Mexican cannon, the origin of that name, you're not the only one. Every historian out there calls it the Golden Standard. Do you have a story or about the origin of that name?
The only name that I feel confident in that cannon is El Volcan. It was stamped in there by the Mexicans. I do not have an origin of the Golden Standard. I've always just heard it was invented by Texans later. Jeff, I think you've done some research on that. Why don't you tell us the real story?
Well, the research I've done indicates that the name does not predate 1931. That's the earliest date that I've seen, and it comes from an interpretation of a Republic of Texas claims record of a San Jacinto veteran from the 19th century. But when you look at that original document in the state archives, it does not look to me like it says Golden Standard. So it wasn't made up. It was Lewis Kemp in the 1930s thought that's what that said, but I'm not so sure that that's correct. So I'm not sure that it really should be called the Golden Standard, but that's my opinion. But all I can say is that the earliest I found that reference is from 1931. And it appeared in the Heroes of San Jacinto book that Lewis Kemp published the next year, 1932.
We can all agree to call it El Volcan.
Yes, I think El Volcan is definitely a more authentic name. Okay. Next question. Okay, we have just one for Sam Haynes. It's not really a question, just a comment, and maybe you can comment on it. I'm so glad to see Sam's presentation discussing a woman's perspective as a member of the DRT, a committee member of the DRT library collection. I'm glad to see this aspect shown. So would you say that the DRT has evolved over the years in its interpretation of the Texas Revolution, particularly after all the tumultuous events of just the 2010 when they lost control of the Alamo? Can you comment on that, Sam? Do you have any thoughts on that? You need to unmute yourself. Can you unmute yourself? Uh-oh. Okay. Okay, we're having trouble there with Sam. It would be the lower left-hand corner. Okay. All right. Mr. Woodruff.
Oh, there we go. There we go.
Good, good.
All right. I was getting a message saying that it was, I couldn't do it on my own. All right. Has the DRT evolved over time? Is that the?
Yeah, just their philosophy, their perspective on the Texas Revolution. You know, there was the attitude that's been presented more recently is that in the late 19th century, there was Jim Crow laws, there was white supremacy, and that the whole saving of the Alamo was to preserve that kind of philosophy or that kind of perspective. I wonder if you can comment on that, and then if that's true, has that changed, or what do you think about that aspect? You didn't really touch upon that in your talk.
I didn't. I think it's important. I think I mentioned that there were a number of DRT members who were also UDC members. Zavala, for example, was a proud member of the UDC. Her father had fought in the Confederacy. I think it's a bit of a stretch, actually, to lay at the feet of the women's groups that are building these statues to say that they are promoting white supremacy. I think that was certainly may have well been a result of it. But I think that to a very large degree, if you take all of those organizations in toto, the DRT, the UDC, the DAR, they were all doing exactly the same thing. And that was trying to memorialize their ancestors. Certainly, this came at a time in the late 19th, early 20th century, which was a very dark period in American race relations. And so I think some people have made those associations. But I would say that their primary motivating factor, impulse, was that of memorialization, to commemorate their ancestors. So, yeah.
And another question for you, have you published your presentation? Can you cite or link to them? Will the text of your presentation be available or published?
Oh. Well, it'll be online here in the symposium. I've actually put this project aside. I'm working on a book of on early 19th century Texas history. It's actually a more conventional history. I start in the 1820s and I go all the way up to 1846, really, 1848, the end of the US-Mexico War. And that project, my publisher is telling me I have to finish in June. And so as soon as it's done, it'll be published next year. But as soon as that project is off my desk, then I'll be working. Well, I'm going to come back to sort of a reappraisal of the DRT and particularly Adina. So much has been written about the feud between Adina and Clara. It's a fascinating story, but I think to a large degree, it's often been misconstrued.
Okay.
I don't want to go into too much detail there, but it's certainly a debate which really does frame our understanding of the Texas Revolution and the meaning of the Alamo. So it's something that we need to take a really good, hard look at. And I don't know that we've really done that. I would just say, in response to the question, that the DRT has gotten a lot of criticism in the 20th century. And I think that's a bit unfair. And not because they were better historians than the men who followed them, simply because there are different narratives which we need to understand when we look at the Texas Revolution. And we can look at those narratives through gender, we can look at them through ethnicity, in all kinds of different ways. And so I did give a talk that was similar to this about a year ago. And a teacher asked me which narrative is correct. And my response was, well, that's really not the right question. There are just simply many different narratives, many different prisms through which we can look at these events. And that's what I would say about that.
Got it. Well, it certainly is a timely topic. So I've got a question here. Maybe this is for Jim Crisp, but anybody can chime in on this. Is the line in the sand at the Alamo fact or myth? I just read Stephen Harrigan's book and it indicates it is a myth, but his book is fiction. What's the truth?
Well, the story of the line in the sand came from a man named Zuber. Zuber was a young person at the time of the battle. He wasn't there. He claimed that Moses Rose, the man who allegedly left the Alamo when Travis gave him permission to do so, showed up as the Zuber's home and repeated the speech that Travis had given. It wasn't until, I think, 1873 that Zuber said he had a miraculous restoration of memory and wrote the speech of Travis with the line in the sand. He later acknowledged that he had made up at least one, maybe two parts of that story. So is there any contemporaneous documentation of that? No. It's Zuber and only Zuber. And Zuber was something of a self-promoter. He lived very long, well into the early 20th century, and told a lot of stories. Let me just follow up on something Sam Haynes said. One of the things I noticed when I got caught up into the Davy Crockett controversy was how things had changed between the 50s and 60s, and even as early as the 90s and the beginning of the 21st century. I noticed on the part of both Alamo conservators like the DRT and Alamo reenactors that in the 50s and 60s, they tended to take their cues and their documentation from the movies.
Yeah.
As one reenactor told me at one time, I used to try to be John Wayne, and now I'm actually trying to be Davy Crockett based on historical documentation. And I know that once when my good friend Dora Guetta, who was my translator when we found the missing pieces of the Della Pena memoir, that when Dora gave a talk at the Alamo, sponsored by the DRT, which I was able to attend, she alluded to the captive Davy Crockett being brought forth to Santa Ana. And there was what I would call a kind of mild frisson in the crowd, you know, just a little bit of a gasp, not much. Someone said that 20 years earlier, the roof would have fallen in if she would have said something like that. And so I really think there's been, and this is true for Texas history generally, a kind of willingness to go back, as Frank and others were doing today, and look at the documentation from the 19th century and do some hard analysis and see what we can draw out of that, rather than just telling the same old story over and over and over again, which is what we tended to get when I was growing up in Texas.
Yeah, and I think part of it is, Jim touched on it, is that a lot of these things, we tend to treat them as contemporary when they are not. And my point about Menchaca is that he's writing he's not writing, he's dictating this in the 1870s. So he's long removed from the events. And so he's making points that are relevant to him about his situation in the 1870s. He contextualizes them by presenting them as having happened in the 1830s, but they're really about what's going on in the 1870s. And so I talked about the San Jacinto portion, but the end of his memoirs has this long description of what San Antonio is like. And so he's describing, he's going house by house. So-and-so lived here, but now it's a hotel. So-and-so lived here. Now it's a livery stable. So-and-so, change.
Mm-hmm.
Is at the end of his life, he's seen all this change take place and he can't help but go back. And I think that happens to many others, and for various motivations. Zuber may have been motivated by, as I say about Menchaca at one point, he tells a good story. He can get a drink at the bar. But so who knows? But I think we need to be critical about stories like that, because we have to determine when they appear and think about what possibly motivated their appearance.
One quick additional note. I had to do a similar kind of thing for Herman Ehrenberg. He's writing in German for a German audience. One of the reasons it took me 28 years to write the book is because he lies a lot and he embellishes a lot. But I'll give you one example and only one. He was there at the surrender of Fannin at the Battle of Coleto. And he says that because Holzinger in the Mexican army could speak German, but not much English, and Ehrenberg was there, that much of the surrender dialogue had to be conducted in German and then translated into Spanish and English. That's absolutely, positively false. There were plenty of interpreters in both Texan and Spanish and Mexican armies, and Spanish and English were used, not German. But writing for the German audience, he wanted to sort of jazz up his story a little bit. So he says that the surrender negotiations were conducted in German. Falsch.
Right. Well, okay. Just one more point on Zuber. If I recall correctly, he wasn't saying that he heard about it from just anybody. He heard about it from his parents. I believe his parents certified the accuracy of his statement in the Texas Almanac. Now, who knows? But, maybe his parents didn't remember, but I just want to point that out. Sometimes, even though those things happen years later, doesn't necessarily mean that they're false. But
That's
I'm not
true.
taking a position one way or the other, but I think that Walter Lord, when he wrote about it, said, it's something that is possible, or something that maybe we is consistent with what was going on at the time. If I recall his comment on that, he didn't totally dismiss it as fake, but that's beside the point. Okay, question for Frank. Has the Mexican officer that Menchaca failed to save at San Jacinto been positively identified? I believe his name was Bertrand. I think that name comes from Labade's account.
Yeah, but we don't know for sure. Because again, Labadie mentions that a Mexican, so it's kind of the association thing. There's just not enough evidence of Menchaca actually having done a particular act that's been attributed to. It's kind of the equivalent of the way that Mary Magdalene is portrayed. She wound up being associated with the prostitute, but it's never clear that she is the prostitute.
Right.
It's just an association that's made. So in Labade's account, the Mexican is turned into Menchaca, but we have no way of knowing for sure, because what Menchaca later on in his writings isn't referring to it. So he would have been the one to, if it had happened, you would think he would have made the case for perhaps who it was. Menchaca also says one other thing later on, and I didn't bring this up, but he talks about Santa Anna recognizing him from when Menchaca would still have been a boy, and Santa Anna was a junior officer in Texas in 1813 under Arredondo. And it's a real stretch to think that Santa Anna would remembering a boy running around town from that long ago. So again, it's just critiquing, analyzing the document, and then trying to parse out why he might have made the comments that he made.
Right. Question for Sam Haynes. In memory of Jan DeVault, do you, Sam, have any comment about the role of the DRT in obtaining San Jacinto battleground for the state? You only briefly touched on it.
Say that.
Do you have any thoughts or comments about the role of the DRT in obtaining San Jacinto battleground for the state?
Well, I mean, I think we owe the DRT a tremendous debt. They were obtaining battlegrounds, and they were preserving sites, and men simply weren't even remotely interested.
Right.
We have to give the DRT their due, and
Right.
and I think we haven't over the years. So, and then of course there's the more recent controversy over we're losing control of the Alamo, which I don't know if people are aware of that, but I think it's probably a good thing to take the Alamo out of private hands. But at the same time, I think that the DRT was not treated particularly well in that process. It was rather an unfortunate thing, and there were a lot of very, very bad feelings as a result. So I really did sympathize with the DRT, and I signed the petition. I think Frank did as well. Did you not? To when they lost control of. I thought that was rather unfortunate. But you know, these controversies, of course, always take place. I mean, you look at the controversy between Adina and Clara. Everybody has their own different view of history, but no.
Okay, Jim Woodward, what are your sources on the twin sisters being at the Battle of Palmito Ranch and their movement to Mexico and the battle there? Is the Alamo 18-pounder, I guess the second question, is the Alamo 18-pounder actually Swedish 9-pounder later bored out to an 18-pounder? Maybe you can understand what he's saying.
I do. Let me answer the second one first. The answer is yes. That was pretty well defined within the last year by a group of people working on the replication of that 18-pounder at the Alamo. And it's been, I think, largely proven without question that gun originally was a 9-pound Finsbach cannon made in Sweden that got bored out to 18 pounds. It has an identical twin mounted in the city park at Goliad. The only difference being that the twin has its original bore. So the answer to that's yes, that was a Swedish gun that got bored out. The first question that was about how do we know about the Battle of Palmito Ranch and then the subsequent stuff, that's almost totally directly taken from those archives that I can't remember what one of the other speakers mentioned earlier. The archives about the Union and the Confederate Army's correspondence at the end of the war. It is explicitly clear when you go in there about what happened, not only at Palmito Ranch, but also about the transfer of those guns from Fort Brown going over to the Mexican side and being given to Mejia, who was the governor there, the general there, and then ultimately going down to Querétaro. So if you want the documentation there, you look at that 1865 version of letters in the records of the Union and Confederate Army.
Very good. Here's another question for you. The Come and Take It cannon at Gonzales, the very famous cannon used in the first battle of the Revolution. The histories I've read is that the cannon was mounted onto the axle and wheels of an ox cart when the settlers learned the Mexican army was coming to reclaim it. Yet it was used to fire occasionally to keep scouting Indians away. On what was it mounted in the first place?
There were two cannons at the Battle of Gonzales. One of them was the one we know as the Come and Take It cannon. It was a bronze 6-pounder that was a really old Spanish cannon that was loaned by the officials in San Antonio to Gonzales in 1831. That gun was mounted on the wheels of Albert Morton's cotton wagon and rolled to San Antonio. The other cannon was a very small esmeril, or a quarter pounder actually, and that gun was obtained from the Mexicans in the Battle of Velasco in 1832. It got brought to Gonzales. It's a little small gun. It got brought to Gonzales early on. It was mounted on a homemade carriage from the sawed off chunks of a cottonwood tree, and it never made it to San Antonio. That homemade carriage seized up Sandy's Creek, and it got thrown in Sandy's Creek, rediscovered later on, and it's currently on exhibit at the Gonzales Memorial Museum. It, by the way, did fire the first shot in that Battle of Gonzales. It's very clear in the Mexican Commander Castañeda's report of those two battles. He talks about the esmeril, the little gun, was fired first, and then later on, the cañón was fired several times. So the proof of two cannons really comes from Castañeda's report of that battle.
Very good. We've got some really interesting comments here about cannons. They're not really questions. I just encourage people to look at the chats and see that. So we don't have Steve Harden here for technical reasons, but there are a couple of questions for him, and maybe some of the other speakers can answer this. The first one is it known who shot Johnny Jenkins and why? A quote unquote suicide with a gunshot wound to the back of the head and with no weapon found is a bit fishy. Anyone care to handle that hardball?
No, I don't want to touch that one.
Okay.
Well, I read the book.
It's a great mystery.
I read the book, and it looks more like a suicide than a murder. There were a lot of reasons for the suicide. He was about to get indicted for arson. Two of his depositories had gone up in flames, and the second one was really suspicious. He had talked to someone about how to commit suicide by using a balloon and a revolver. his business partner, J.P. Bryan, believes that it was suicide. He did have a lot of gambling debts too. The story that I've heard from one bookseller was that the gamblers came and knocked him off. But I think suicide is a much more likely story. And I would reiterate what Steve Harden said, that Bluffing Texas Style is just a superior book, very well researched. And Steve is also right that it doesn't do justice to the actual accomplishments of Johnny Jenkins, who was extremely supportive of me when I began my Texas history work, and whose 10-volume Papers of the Texas Revolution not only made Steve's career possible, but made my work possible. I could not have done my book or a recent chapter I did for another book without having that a magnificent 10-volume Papers of the Texas Revolution.
Very good. All right, here's another one. If anyone wants to tackle this, Dr. Harden mentioned that Robert Coleman had, quote, an axe to grind, unquote, with Sam Houston, and this might have influenced his decision to publish the Houston Displayed. Can anyone speak to this point specifically? What was the axe that he was grinding? Anyone want to care to take that? I think we'll need to kind of let Steve kind of answer for himself.
I was the godfather of that book. I'm on the board of the Library of Texas and recruited Steve to do that book because I wanted someone who was not a big Houston fan to do the book, and he did a fabulous job. And actually, over the course of his research, became more critical of Coleman than he had ever been before. One of the things that didn't come out in Steve's talk was just how contumelious a person Coleman was. But like a lot of Houston's officers, Houston's subordinates, he resented Sam Houston. He was by no means alone in having that axe to grind, and thought that Houston had taken far too much credit for the victory at San Jacinto. He may have had more axes than that to grind.
Right. And
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just echo that. And I think it's to understand the anger, just the fury, really, of Houston's enemies. You really need to know something about these ideas about that undergird Southern honor at the time. The fact that Houston was seen as someone who was taking credit that he didn't deserve was really a damning sin on his part. The sin of vanity that you see leveled at Houston over and over and over again is something that people took very, very seriously. And they were enraged that Houston was getting credit. The same thing happens with annexation. Houston claims credit for annexation to the fury of his political enemies at home, and also to President John Tyler, who deserved more than a little credit for getting annexation consummated. But you see this again and again in Houston's career, that he was seen as something of a showboater, something of a grandstander. And, we like to describe Houston. I think every biographer has probably used this term to describe him, larger than life. And I think that's an appropriate way to describe him. At the same time, if you understand the culture in 1836, this idea of somebody appropriating the credit that others thought they were due was something that was really seen as a serious shortcoming. And that's the only way you can understand the anger of Houston's contemporaries towards it.
Sam, is it also true that Houston refused to fight duels when people would challenge him?
That's right. He said he gives a number. So it's like more than 24. And of course, his famous line about David G. Burnett, who was much shorter than he was, "I refuse to fight downhill."
What you said about his vanity is absolutely true. My absolute favorite story about Houston is that the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire
Right.
had sent Houston this Turkish costume, complete with the toes that roll up at the end of the shoes. And when Houston wanted to feel really good, he would put on his Turkish costume and pad around his domicile in his Turkish suit. That's a bizarre image, but apparently that's a true story.
And it's important to remember that in 1836, nobody dressed in an eccentric or idiosyncratic way. Everyone's seen, the lithographs and the paintings of adult males, and they're all dressed in a uniform. It's a black frock coat, it's a white shirt, it's a black tie. And for someone to dress in any way outside the norm was considered it's far more serious a shortcoming than we see it today. Today, we're much more tolerant of idiosyncrasies and eccentricities. But in the early 19th century, in the Jacksonian period, that was absolutely not the case. And the Sultan story is great, but Houston seems to have dressed in Cherokee garb almost all the time.
Well, Calhoun was angry at him for appearing in Washington as a
Right.
Cherokee ambassador in Cherokee garb.
Right.
I also love that leopard skin vest that he's
Right.
sporting.
This is something that gentlemen did not do in the early decades of the 19th century.
I got a follow-up question here. What about Houston having different ideas about respecting Native peoples and others? Would that make people critical of him?
Yes, and it's absolutely true.
It's really hard to find someone who takes the view that he does of the Cherokees and other tribes. He really is an outlier in that regard. It's quite extraordinary. Law is much more part of the mainstream. Houston's Indian policy in both terms, the first term and the second term, were really quite extraordinary, but particularly the second term. I don't know, I don't want to go on in great detail here, but the Treaty of Tawakana Springs in the fall of 1843, where he brings together all of the tribes of Texas, Cherokees, Chickasaws, Caddos, and even the Comanches, which was really the great coup. That's an amazing thing, bringing all of those tribes together. Very little is established at that treaty, and it's not ratified by the Texas Senate. The act of bringing all of those tribes together in a great conclave at Torrey's Trading House is really an astonishing story.
Houston also wrote defenses in public, in the press, of Indian intelligence, Indian legal rights, Indian landholding rights. He was about as much Indian as he was anything else. I would just add that that's what got me onto Ehrenberg, because the way I got onto Ehrenberg in 1992 is that there was this speech quoted by a number of historians, an anti-Indian, anti-Mexican speech by Sam Houston. He didn't write it. He didn't speak it. That was Ehrenberg writing in German in 1842. And that's what made me, first of all, come to Sam's rescue as if he needed it. And secondly, start looking up Ehrenberg, because no one knew who the hell Ehrenberg was in the 1990s. Virtually no one knew who he was.
Okay, I've got one other question here. Can anyone comment on the case of Forbes, who allegedly killed a Mexican woman? What details can you provide about this situation? And I guess I could say, well, I gave a presentation at a symposium, I think it was 2019, on women of the San Jacinto, and it's covered there. You can go look at the video, but the sources would be Dr. Labadie was the one who publicly made the first public attack or first public statement about that situation. And the story there is there were a handful of women behind Mexican lines who were, for better or worse, called camp followers, but they could be relatives also of some of the soldiers. Unlike the Texan side, there were no women on the Texan side, but there were a handful of women. A couple of them actually escaped and made it back to Mexican lines, at least one did. And the others were captured, but one was killed. And Colonel John Forbes, the quartermaster, was accused of that. But the publication didn't come out until 1858. And a very famous libel lawsuit resulted over that. The transcripts of the depositions are available. They're not published, but you can find them at most of the university libraries. But
Jeff, let me give a plug to you to that article you did on women of San Jacinto in the book that Mary Shear edited called Women of the Texas Revolution.
right.
That's available. It's still in print. And if any of you out there in the audience want to read more about women in the Texas Revolution, that's a really great source for those stories.
Yeah, and of course, we go into the real famous story of Emily D. West, which hasn't been mentioned today, who was.
Oh, yes, it has. You just did.
I just did. Okay. Who famously was alleged to be in Santa Anna's tent at the time the Texas attack, quote unquote, distracting him. And that story has been also almost exhaustively narrated. But the article that I wrote in Mary Shear's book discusses that incident. And I believe I also did a symposium talk about that some years ago as well, just focused on that particular topic. It's very, very interesting. It's interesting about this whole episode and even gets with Sam is what we know about the Alamo comes from a woman, Susanna Dickinson, and an African-American, Joe, the slave. And it's really most of what the Texans knew about the Alamo came from them. And it's amazing that even in San Jacinto, that the few women that were there made an impression, or at least later on became part of the literature, the Emily D. West story and the Mexican woman who was killed. And so it's these are interesting aspects of the two battles that are just coming. And also in Goliad, you have the Angel of Goliad, the woman who helped save some of the Texans. So these stories are important, and they're beginning to come out and be more prominent.
Jeff, I'll also plug the article that you and Jim Lutzweiler did on the Yellow Rose of Texas. That is the song itself, which was written long after the Texas Revolution. And
right.
Nothing to do with San Jacinto, although popular myth has made Emily West into the so-called Yellow Rose of Texas. But the Handbook of Texas Online, I believe, has that article that you and Jim Lutzweiler did on the Yellow Rose of Texas. It's really an amazing story of the music and the myth.
Right. Okay. Final question. Is there a website where we can rewatch the symposium? And after the editing process is finished, it will be posted probably both on TSHA's website and the San Jacinto Battleground Association's website as well. We keep records of both of them. But so without further ado, I'd like to thank each of our speakers. I'd like to thank everyone who signed up and listened this morning to our presentations. I'd like to thank the sponsors of our 2021 symposium. Heather Wooten, who is executive director of TSHA, wanted to say something, but we had some technical difficulties there. We really appreciate this. Hopefully next year we'll be live, and maybe we'll even have a virtual component to it as we're learning how to use this new technology. But thank you very much, everybody. And this will conclude our 2021 San Jacinto Symposium.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Right.
Jeff.
Thank you.
Thank you.